So Shery, I've been reading this book.
Yeah? What is it?
It was a novel written by F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Great Gatsby.
Oh, I've heard of that. How was it?
Well, it was fine and all, but I had a bit of trouble understanding, well, where it took place.
Oh, that novel? It took place in the 20s.
Yeah, you see, my memory's kind of jaded about the 1920s. Do you care to enlighten me?
Well, I was busy writing a 1,000-letter word for Miss Rudin, but I'm sure I have time to teach you all about the Roaring Twenties.
Roaring Twenties?
Yeah, the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties was an age of dramatic social and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but unfamiliar consumer society. People from coast to coast bought the same goods, listened to the same music, did the same dances, and even used the same slang. Many Americans were uncomfortable with this new, urban, sometimes racy, mass culture. In fact, for many, even most people in the United States, the 1920s brought many conflicts and celebration. However, for a small handful of young people in the nation's big cities, the 20s were roaring indeed.
Alright, the Roaring Twenties. Now I remember an important feature of the 1920s was the Jazz Age, which was a feature where jazz music and dance became popular. This occurred particularly in the United States, but also in other places like Britain and other regions in Europe. Jazz was very different from any music that these young people's parents had ever listened to. Loud and syncopated, featuring the sultry sounds of the saxophone. Unlike other popular music of the day, jazz was considered an evil influence on America's young people. With its offbeat rhythms and strange melodies, jazz was blamed for everything from drunkenness and deafness to an increase in unwed mothers. America was facing a most serious situation regarding its popular music. Welfare workers tell us that never in our history of our line have there been such immoral conditions among our young people, and in the surveys made by many organizations regarding these conditions, the blame is laid on jazz music. Despite such opinions, jazz was immensely popular. Dance bands around the country listened to the latest jazz recordings and bought cheap music in order to learn the newest tunes for their small town audiences. In the Sheridan area, the Lucas Jazz Band, the Melody Sextet, and the Harmony Girls played jazz, along with waltzes, foxtrots, and two-steps.
Oh yeah, and accompanying with the Jazz Age were women known as flappers, who were a new breed of young Western women in the 1920s who wore short skirts, bobbed their hair, listened to jazz, and flaunted their disdain for what was then considered acceptable behavior. Flappers were seen as brash for wearing excessive makeup, drinking, treating sex in a casual manner, smoking, driving automobiles, and otherwise flattering social and sexual norms. Flappers had their origins in the liberal period of the Roaring Twenties, the social, political turbulence, and increased transatlantic cultural exchange that followed the end of World War I, as well as the export of American jazz culture to Europe. With the women's suffrage at its peak in the 1920s and the entrance of the flapper women began to make a statement within society, and the Jazz Age was not immune to these new ideals. With women now taking part in the workforce after the end of the First World War, there were many more possibilities for women in their terms of social life and entertainment. Ideas like equality and free sexuality were very popular during the time, and women seemed to capitalize during this period. The 1920s saw the emergence of many famous women musicians, including Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith also gained attention because she was not only a great singer but also an African American woman. She has grown through the ages to be one of the most well-respected singers of all time. Singers such as Billie Holiday and Janis Joplin were inspired by Bessie Smith. Another exception to the common stereotype of women at this time was piano player Louis Armstrong's wife. She was given the piano part in her husband's big band radio performance series called Hot 5, and then his next series called the Hot 7. It was not until the 1930s and 1940s that many women jazz players, such as Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday, were recognized as successful artists in the music world. These women were persistent in striving to make their names known in the music industry and led the way for many more women artists to come.
That's fascinating. Also in the 1920s, from what I remember, was Prohibition was enacted. And from what I can recall, Prohibition made the use and transmission of alcohol in any corner in America illegal. However, it was kind of ironic how Prohibition made alcohol illegal, yet more people found more ways to obtain alcohol more easily. For example, speakeasies is a great example. Speakeasies made the use of alcohol and transmission more easily, and also with the help of having alcohol without the presence of policemen or government officials. Speakeasies popped up everywhere. One site said that as soon as the owner could get a padlock for the door, speakeasy was good to go. Although they were places where the law was being broken, they did a lot of good. First off, the bars of the early 20th century were mainly hangouts for men. However, speakeasies were open to both. Jazz also blossomed during this era. The speakeasies provided an outlet for musicians to play and all had a good time. Interestingly, many professional bartenders refused to serve alcohol illegally. They would often combine different drinks from different ingredients to serve their customers. Many people wonder why prohibition failed. One of the primary reasons was that there was just not enough money or police power to stop illegal places like speakeasies from popping up. A lot of the corruption also had to do with why prohibition also failed. So yes, I understand all of these factors about the 1920s. The Jazz Age, Prohibition, the Flappers, all of that stuff. However, Shery, what does any of this have to do with The Great Gatsby?
Well, Xavier, the author of The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, lived during the Roaring Twenties and related events he encountered or observed during this era and incorporated it in the novel. For example, the year of Great Gatsby when the narrator Nick Carraway came to East Egg was 1922, where he then explains the transformation of New York City after he moved to climb bond businesses and after serving in World War I. Carraway moved next door to a man named Jay Gatsby, who owns a mansion and throws parties every weekend. Nick attended one of these parties and described that these parties consisted of music, predominantly accompanied by jazz, had dances like the Charleston, and had large amounts of alcohol, which was banned due to prohibition at this time. But Gatsby obtained alcohol through speakeasies, which, as you mentioned earlier, Xavier, that speakeasies was an establishment that illegally sold alcohol beverages. What's funny about this year 1922 is that Fitzgerald based Gatsby's parties on the equally lavish parties Fitzgerald attended himself for the first time in Great Neck in 1922. Moreover, during the Roaring Twenties, many people were very wealthy after World War I. So, Fitzgerald developed Jay Gatsby's character to be character by giving him the background of a man who wanted to play ragtime. Flappers played a role in Fitzgerald's novel by how they cut their hair short, smoked, wore short skirts and fancy clothing, and most importantly, stepping up in society. Fitzgerald most closely brings these characteristics of a flapper to another main character named Daisy Buchanan. Many technological innovations came during the Roaring Twenties, but Fitzgerald mostly centralized automobiles in his novel to emphasize how, in reality, automobiles were very popular at this time period. He described them ideally as the reason for the climax of the novel to occur, which was when Daisy Buchanan drove a yellow coupe and killed George Wilson's wife, Myrtle Wilson. The type of crime during the Roaring Twenties was bootlegging, which is included in Fitzgerald's novel to explain how Gatsby gained most of his wealth. So, Xavier, in conclusion, the Roaring Twenties was a time of celebration after a devastating war and was a period of time in America characterized by prosperity and optimism. In addition, the 1920s was a time of great economic prosperity, making many people rich and wealthy. The Roaring Twenties fell short as the stock market crash arose in 1929, ultimately leading America to a time period known as the Great Depression. Hey, I just noticed something. In the new remake of the Great Gatsby movie, Brian Mullick looks so much like Leonardo DiCaprio. He should definitely play Gatsby in another remake.